What if the most unsettling part of this story isn't what Kensington Palace said, but what it didn't? Picture this. It's late. Phones buzz. Newsrooms tense. Social feeds refresh at a frantic pace. And then, without warning, a short, carefully worded announcement appears under the authority of Kensington Palace. No dramatic headline. No emotional language. Just enough information to confirm something is wrong, and nowhere near enough to explain what. Within minutes, tears flow online. Panic spreads. Speculation explodes. And one name sits at the center of it all, Meghan Markle. Now pause for a second. Ask yourself this. When was the last time a royal-related statement made you feel this uneasy so fast? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because this wasn't just another update. It wasn't a scheduling change or a ceremonial note. The tone was different. The timing was strange. And the reaction was immediate. Why? Because almost instantly, 3 words began circulating alongside that announcement. Words no palace ever once attached to its name. Car. Crash. Accident. But here's where the story takes its first sharp turn. The palace didn't confirm those words. It didn't deny them either. And in the world of royal communications, silence is never accidental. So what really happened? Why did Kensington Palace feel compelled to speak at all? And why did their statement seem to raise more questions than it answered? Let's slow this down. Because to understand why this moment hits so hard, you need to understand the emotional weight already hanging in the air before a single word was released. For years, Meghan Markle has existed in a space no modern royal spouse ever truly occupied before. Too famous for the institution. Too independent for tradition. Too outspoken for silence. Too human for a system built on restraint. Loved fiercely. Criticized relentlessly. Watched constantly. And whether people defend her or doubt her, one thing is undeniable. When Meghan's name enters the headlines, emotions follow. That's why this announcement landed like a thunderclap. Not because of what it confirmed, but because of what it hinted at. Look closely at the wording. Notice how carefully it avoided detail. See how it acknowledged concern without offering clarity. Royal statements are designed to calm the public. This one didn't. Instead, it created a vacuum. And nature hates a vacuum. Into that empty space rushed speculation, fear, memory, and something even more powerful, history. People began asking questions out loud that no one wanted to hear. Is she safe? Was anyone else involved? Why is this coming from Kensington Palace and not California? Why now? And then came the comparisons. Quiet at first, then louder. Because for many, the idea of a royal-adjacent car incident doesn't exist in isolation. It echoes. It carries ghosts. It pulls at old wounds the monarchy has never fully healed. Is it fair to make those connections? Maybe not. Is it inevitable? Absolutely. And the palace knows that. Which makes this next detail impossible to ignore. The announcement came at a moment when Meghan had been noticeably absent from public view. No recent appearances. No casual updates. No reassuring social media presence. Just quiet. Too quiet. Now, some will say that's normal. That privacy was always the goal. That stepping back means stepping away. But here's the contradiction. When everything is fine, silence feels like peace. When something is wrong, silence feels like dread. And the internet can sense the difference. Within hours, unverified reports began circulating. Some claimed a minor incident. Others suggested something far more serious. A few hinted at near misses, evasive maneuvers, moments where things could have gone very differently. None of it confirmed. All of it shared. And while journalists scrambled to verify facts, the public did what it always does in moments like this. It filled in the blanks emotionally. Because when official channels go quiet, imagination takes over. Now let's talk about Kensington Palace for a moment. This is not an institution that speaks impulsively. Every word is debated. Every comma weighed. Statements go through layers of approval, legal review, and strategic consideration. So why speak at all? Why not wait? Why not let the dust settle? Why not allow representatives in the U.S. to handle it? Unless waiting wasn't an option. Unless the palace knew something was already moving faster than they could control. Unless the story was going to break, with or without them. And that possibility alone should make you pause. Because when institutions act early, it's rarely out of kindness. It's about containment. Containment of panic. Containment of narrative. Containment of comparisons no one wants drawn. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Containment only works when people trust you. And trust, in this story, is already fractured. Some viewers immediately felt sympathy, fear, genuine concern for Meghan as a human being, a mother, a wife. Others reacted with skepticism, questioning the timing, the framing, the motives. Two camps, one story, zero clarity. And sitting between them is a woman who, for years, has said she felt unheard, unprotected, and overwhelmed by the very system now speaking on her behalf. Do you see the irony? The palace that once insisted on silence is now issuing a statement that still says almost nothing, yet expects the world to remain calm. That disconnect is where tension lives, and it's why this story refuses to settle. Because beneath the headlines and hashtags, there's a deeper question humming quietly in the background. What does it take for concern to become action? For whispers to become warnings? For pressure to become unbearable? You don't have to take sides to feel the weight of that question. You just have to be paying attention. Now consider this. The phrase car crash carries power far beyond its literal meaning. It suggests chaos, loss of control, a sudden interruption of normal life. And whether the reports prove exaggerated or understated, the emotional response is already real. Fear doesn't wait for confirmation, and neither does memory. That's why so many people felt a chill reading that announcement. Not because they knew what happened, but because they feared what could have. Because sometimes, the scariest stories aren't about tragedy itself. They're about how close it came. And yet, through all of this, one voice remained absent. Meghan's. No statement. No reassurance. No denial. Just the palace speaking, from thousands of miles away, into a void filled with speculation. Ask yourself this. If everything were truly fine, would the response look like this? If this were routine, would it feel so heavy? And if it were serious, would we even be told? These questions matter, not because they accuse, but because they reveal how fragile the relationship between institution, individual, and public has become. This story isn't just about an announcement. It's about control. It's about narrative. It's about what happens when the carefully maintained balance between privacy and transparency collapses under pressure. And we're only at the beginning. Because shortly after the palace statement went live, something else happened, something far less official, far more revealing, and far more unsettling. A detail surfaced, small, almost overlooked. But once noticed, it changed how people interpreted everything. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. What kind of announcement makes the world stop breathing, without actually saying anything at all? That's the question people kept asking in the moments after Kensington Palace released its statement. Not shouted, not dramatized, just placed, quietly, almost politely, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. And yet, everything felt wrong. Royal announcements usually follow a script. A familiar rhythm. Births are joyful, deaths are formal, illnesses are cautiously optimistic. Even scandals are wrapped in carefully neutral language designed to soften the blow. This one didn't fit. It was short, almost cold, devoid of warmth. No reassuring adjectives. No future-looking phrases. No, we are pleased to confirm, or she is doing well. Just an acknowledgement that concern was warranted, and nothing more. Why? Let's rewind to the exact moment it dropped. News desks were quiet. Not dead, just calm. Social media was cycling through its usual arguments. No trending alarms. No flashing red banners. And then, suddenly, alerts began popping up across screens worldwide. Kensington Palace. Statement released. Regarding Meghan Markle. Immediately, editors leaned forward. Not because they knew what was coming, but because they knew what it could mean. You see, Kensington Palace does not speak casually about Meghan Markle anymore. Jurisdictionally, geographically, symbolically, she exists at a distance from the institution. So when the palace chooses to issue a statement involving her, it signals something out of the ordinary. That alone raised eyebrows. But it was the tone that sent chills. No personal touch. No quote attributed to Meghan. No reference to Harry's voice or perspective. Just institutional language. Clean. Sparse. Almost sterile. And within seconds, people noticed what wasn't there. There was no timeline. No explanation. No cause. Just enough information to confirm concern, and enough restraint to leave the door wide open to interpretation. Now ask yourself this. When institutions withhold detail, who fills the gap? The public does. Journalists began parsing every word. Every comma. Every phrase was treated like a puzzle piece. Analysts compared it to past statements, lining them up side by side like forensic evidence. And something became clear very quickly. This announcement was unusually rushed. Royal statements typically appear after internal alignment, after messaging teams agree on tone, after legal departments ensure nothing can be misinterpreted. This one felt reactive, as if it was responding to something already moving. And that's when the whispers began. Some reporters claimed they had been tipped off hours earlier that something was coming. Others said they were told to hold stories. A few mentioned last-minute embargo changes. Never a good sign. Then came the timestamp, a detail most casual readers missed. The statement was released at a time that didn't align neatly with either UK or California schedules. Too late for one, too early for the other. Almost as if it was time to interrupt, not accommodate, the news cycle. Why does that matter? Because timing in media isn't about convenience. It's about control. Drop a story too early, and speculation runs wild. Drop it too late, and you're accused of hiding something. This release sat awkwardly in between, as though the palace was trying to get ahead of something without fully stepping into the spotlight. A preemptive move. But preemptive to what? That question began spreading faster than any confirmed fact. Within minutes, social media latched onto one word buried deep in early reporting: incident. Not accident. Not emergency. Incident. A word so vague it could mean almost anything. And therefore, everything. Was it physical? Emotional? Medical? Environmental? No one knew. And the palace wasn't clarifying. Instead, outlets began contacting sources. Some official, some not. Some reliable, some questionable. And here's where things started to fracture. Different newsrooms were hearing different things. One reporter said it involved transportation. Another said it was a near miss. A third insisted it was being blown out of proportion. None of them could publish confirmation, but all of them felt the tension. Because when facts are scarce, instincts take over. And instincts told them this was serious. Now think about this from the palace's perspective. If the situation were minor, why not say so? If it were serious, why not prepare the public more carefully? That contradiction sits at the heart of this entire chapter. The palace chose to acknowledge concern without defining its scale. That's dangerous. Because people don't sit comfortably with ambiguity when emotions are involved. They fill it with fear. And fear doesn't wait for permission. Within an hour, car crash began trending. Not because the palace said it, but because the public connected dots that hadn't yet been drawn officially. Transportation, incident, urgency, and then history. The comparisons were immediate, almost instinctual. Commentators urged restraint. Others warned against speculation. But once a narrative enters the bloodstream, it doesn't leave easily. And again, silence didn't help. Meghan's representatives didn't speak. Harry didn't issue a personal statement. No images emerged to calm nerves. Nothing. Just the palace's carefully distant voice echoing into a storm it had partially triggered. Now let's address the uncomfortable question many were asking quietly. Why was Kensington Palace the messenger? Meghan lives in the United States. Her day-to-day life is not governed by palace operations. So why was this institution, known for formality and restraint, stepping forward now? Some analysts suggested it was symbolic. Others said it was strategic. A few whispered that it was necessary because something crossed a threshold, a line where the monarchy's shadow could no longer stay out of frame. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. The palace reclaimed narrative authority, but without offering narrative clarity. And that's when the story shifted from concern to suspicion. People began questioning motives. Was this about care or control? Was it about compassion or containment? Was the palace protecting Meghan or protecting itself? These aren't conspiracy questions. They're human ones. Because trust is built on transparency. And this moment felt opaque. Add to that the emotional context Meghan has shared in the past about pressure, scrutiny, fear. And suddenly, the announcement carried more weight than its words suggested. It felt heavy, loaded, unresolved. And then journalists noticed something else. This statement didn't come with a follow-up plan. No promise of updates. No reassurance of ongoing communication. Just a momentary acknowledgement, and then silence again. That's rare. Usually, royal communications set expectations. Further updates will be provided. We ask for privacy. The situation is being monitored. None of that appeared here. It was as if the palace wanted to say just enough to stop something, without committing to anything further. That raises a chilling possibility. What if this statement wasn't meant for the public at all? What if it was aimed at someone else? At media outlets preparing stories. At insiders leaking information. At narratives forming faster than facts. A signal, not an explanation. And signals, by nature, suggest something is happening behind the scenes. As the hours passed, reactions grew more polarized. Some viewers accused the media of fear-mongering. Others accused the palace of obfuscation. Supporters of Meghan expressed genuine concern, even anger, that her well-being was being discussed without her voice. Critics questioned why the story felt familiar, why it followed patterns they'd seen before. Two truths can exist at once. Concern can be real. Skepticism can be earned. And in the middle of it all is a woman whose life has repeatedly become a battleground for narratives larger than herself. By the end of that first day, one thing was clear. This announcement didn't calm anyone. It ignited something. Questions, memories, tension. And just when the palace may have hoped the story would settle, a new detail began circulating quietly among reporters. A detail about timing. A detail about sequence. A detail that suggested the announcement might not have been the beginning of this story at all, but a reaction to something that had already happened. And once that realization set in, the tone changed completely. Because if that's true, then what we saw was not transparency. It was damage control. What if the most dangerous part of this story didn't happen on the road, but in the minutes before anyone knew what to believe? Because before Kensington Palace spoke, before headlines stabilized, before journalists could even verify a single concrete fact, the internet had already decided something terrible had occurred. And once that idea took hold, there was no pulling it back. This is where the story truly fractures. Not at the palace gates, not in an official statement, but in the shadows between rumor and reality. It began the way modern crises almost always do, not with confirmation, but with whispers. A post here, a message there. A vague hearing reports from accounts that had broken news before, or at least claimed they had. No names, no photos, no timestamps, just enough to trigger panic. Within minutes, the word incident evolved into something far more specific. Transportation, security, sudden movement, emergency protocols, and then the phrase that made everyone sit up straight. Car crash. Now stop for a second and ask yourself this. Who benefits from spreading that phrase without confirmation? Not journalists. They risk credibility. Not the palace. They risk chaos. Not Meghan. She risks becoming a symbol instead of a person. Yet the phrase spread anyway. Why? Because fear moves faster than facts. And because the public has been trained, over decades, to associate royal narratives with sudden turns, tragic echoes, and unfinished stories. That emotional conditioning matters. The moment car crash entered the conversation, the story stopped being about clarification and became about memory. Memory doesn't care about accuracy. It cares about feeling. And the feeling was dread. Early reports varied wildly. Some said it was minor. Others said it was avoided at the last second. A few insisted it was being deliberately downplayed. No two versions aligned perfectly, and that inconsistency only fueled suspicion. If it were truly nothing, why couldn't anyone agree on what nothing looked like? Journalists began reaching out to sources close to Meghan's security detail. Some declined to comment. Others said they hadn't been briefed. A few quietly acknowledged that something had happened, but refused to characterize it. That refusal spoke volumes. Because in media culture, there's a big difference between no comment and we can't talk about that. One suggests irrelevance. The other suggests sensitivity. And sensitivity suggests stakes. As these whispers intensified, a strange contradiction emerged. Some outlets were being warned off the story entirely, told it was irresponsible to speculate. Others were quietly encouraged to tread carefully, but not discouraged from reporting. That split response created confusion. Why silence some voices and not others? Why allow ambiguity to thrive instead of shutting it down? Unless ambiguity served a purpose. unless keeping the story undefined allowed different audiences to interpret it in ways that benefited different interests. Now consider the role of social media in all of this. Platforms that thrive on immediacy do not reward patience. They reward reaction. And reaction, in this case, was emotional. People weren't sharing because they knew something. They were sharing because they felt something. Concern, fear, anger, protectiveness. And in that emotional rush, details began to morph. A near collision became an accident. An incident involving a vehicle became a crash. A security-related event became a life-threatening moment. None of it verified. All of it believed by someone. And here's the most unsettling part. Even as some journalists tried to slow the narrative down, others leaned into it, not out of malice, but out of pressure. Because when a story is moving this fast, being last feels like being irrelevant. So headlines hedged, language softened, question marks replaced statements. Was Meghan involved in a car incident? Reports suggest possible transportation scare. Unconfirmed claims spark concern. Each one technically cautious, yet collectively explosive. Now add to that the public's awareness of Meghan's past experiences with paparazzi, pursuit, and pressure. The story didn't exist in a vacuum. People connected dots emotionally, not logically. They remembered interviews. They remembered confessions. They remembered warnings. And suddenly, the idea of a car-related incident didn't feel random. It felt inevitable. That perception alone is powerful, because inevitability suggests failure, not of circumstance, but of systems. Security systems, media systems, institutional systems. And when people believe a failure has occurred, they start assigning blame. Some blame the press. Some blame the palace. Some blame the public itself. But notice who wasn't being blamed. Meghan. For once, skepticism softened into concern. That shift matters, because public sentiment doesn't change easily. And when it does, it's usually triggered by a sense of vulnerability. The idea that something might have happened, even if it didn't, made Meghan feel fragile in a way headlines rarely allow. And fragility invites protection, but it also invites manipulation. Now here's where the story takes a darker turn. As speculation peaked, a few accounts began circulating supposed details, routes, locations, timelines. None of it substantiated, some of it geographically impossible. Yet it spread anyway. Why? Because specificity creates credibility, even when it's false. The more detailed a rumor sounds, the more people assume it must be true. And soon, people were arguing not about whether something happened, but about how bad it was. That's a dangerous shift. Because once the question changes from "did this occur?" to "how severe was it?", the narrative is already out of control. At this point, the palace's silence became deafening. They had spoken once, briefly, and then disappeared. No corrections, no clarifications, no denials, just absence. Now imagine you're watching this unfold as someone close to Meghan. Every refresh brings a new version of events. Every headline feels heavier than the last. And still, no unified truth. That kind of environment doesn't just confuse the public. It destabilizes the people at the center of the story. Which raises another uncomfortable question. Was the palace's initial statement meant to stop this, or did it accidentally trigger it? Because by acknowledging concern without context, they validated the idea that something was wrong, without limiting how wrong it could be. That's a communications nightmare, and one that professionals are trained to avoid. Unless the alternative was worse. Unless staying silent would have allowed an even more damaging version of events to dominate the narrative. That possibility suggests the palace was reacting, not leading. And reacting means you're already behind. As the hours passed, some outlets began pulling back, issuing corrections, softening language, removing speculative posts. Others doubled down, and the public noticed. Why retract now? What changed? Who made the call? The retractions didn't calm people. They unsettled them further. Because sudden caution often signals new information behind the scenes. Information the public doesn't have. At the same time, voices close to Meghan remained absent. No friendly journalist offering reassurance. No casual citing to quiet fears. No indirect confirmation through trusted channels. Just quiet. And quiet, in a storm like this, feels intentional. That intentionality sparked a new theory, one less sensational, but but more unsettling. What if this wasn't about a dramatic crash at all? What if it was about something smaller, but more personal? A moment that didn't warrant headlines, but did warrant concern. A scare rather than a disaster. Because those are often the moments that shake people the most. Not the things that happen, but the things that almost do. And yet, the car crash narrative had already taken on a life of its own. Even careful journalists couldn't fully contain it, because the public wasn't waiting for permission to feel. Now here's a detail that complicates everything. Several early reports used the phrase security-related. That word is doing a lot of work. Security-related could mean many things. A threat assessment, an evasive maneuver, a route change, a crowd issue. It doesn't automatically mean collision, but once paired with vehicle, the implication is unavoidable. And because Meghan's history includes heightened security concerns, the phrase carries extra weight. So which is it? A physical incident? A preventative action? A misinterpreted protocol? The answer matters, but not as much as the fact that no one clarified. And that brings us back to the palace. Because if the palace knew the truth and chose not to correct false assumptions, that decision has consequences. It allows fear to grow. It allows comparisons to flourish. It allows trust to erode. But if the palace didn't yet know the full truth themselves, that's even more alarming. Because it suggests a breakdown in communication at the highest level. Either way, the result was the same. By nightfall, the phrase car crash had embedded itself in the public imagination, whether accurate or not. And once embedded, it becomes almost impossible to remove. This is how narratives harden, not through confirmation, but through repetition. And repetition doesn't care about nuance. Now ask yourself this. If nothing truly happened, would this story have spiraled like this? If something serious did happen, would we be left guessing this long? That contradiction is the engine driving this entire chapter. Because ambiguity creates space for fear, and fear creates momentum. By the end of the day, one thing was undeniable. Whatever the truth was, it was no longer the only thing that mattered. Perception had taken over. And perception, once unleashed, doesn't wait for facts to catch up. But just when the story seemed stuck between rumor and restraint, a new development began quietly reshaping the conversation. Not a headline, not a leak, but an absence so profound it demanded explanation. Because while the world debated what happened on the road, Montecito said nothing. When silence speaks louder than statements, everyone listens. That was the reality in the hours after Kensington Palace's announcement. While headlines flashed and social media exploded, Meghan Markle's camp. The very people who could provide context, clarity, or reassurance said nothing. Not a word. No official comment. No spokesperson statement. No subtle hint that everything was under control. Just quiet. And in a world that thrives on information, absence is deafening. Ask yourself this. What does it feel like to watch someone you care about at the center of a storm while knowing the only voices you hear are speculation and rumor? That's exactly what happened as the public waited for a sign. Any sign that Meghan was safe. The initial reaction from observers was twofold. Some assumed caution, thinking Meghan and Harry's team were simply respecting privacy. That's plausible, of course. Royals often move quietly. They often act behind the scenes. But the way this silence coincided with swirling reports about a car-related incident created a new layer of concern. It wasn't just the lack of a statement. It was the timing of that silence. Consider this. Meghan's absence from public life had already been noticeable for months. She had stepped back from certain commitments, limited appearances, and now, during this crisis, there was complete radio silence. Harry was reportedly in the United States, Meghan in Montecito, but the family unit was physically distant, and their public presence was non-existent. It's important to realize what silence communicates in moments like this. Silence does not exist in a vacuum. People interpret it. And in this situation, every observer was left to fill in the blanks themselves. Are they hiding something? Are they trying to manage the narrative? Is this worse than it seems? Even those who wanted to assume the best couldn't. The mind defaults to protection mode when uncertainty intersects with emotional investment. And in the case of Meghan, a figure constantly scrutinized and sensationalized, emotions ran high. Meanwhile, journalists were racing to piece together the story. Some were being warned off speculation by anonymous sources who insisted, Do not report unverified details. Others were being nudged to look deeper. Who was leaking? Who was staying quiet? Which signals were real and which were manipulation? The result was chaos. Newsrooms struggled to differentiate between fact, rumor, and misinterpretation. Every outlet faced the same challenge. Report too boldly and risk inaccuracy. Report too cautiously and risk irrelevance. And the public noticed this too. Social media users began dissecting the silence itself. Analysts and fans alike examined Meghan's past behavior, Harry's communication style, and the patterns of palace statements. Every absence, every delayed post, every omitted detail became fodder for speculation. Some even drew parallels to previous incidents involving the royal family. Moments where lack of information had amplified fear. Moments where silence had been a strategic tool or a miscalculation. This created a unique tension. For the palace and Meghan's team, silence may have been intended as protection. But for the public, it became anxiety. And for some journalists, it became a puzzle to solve, a gap in the timeline demanding answers. Into this vacuum stepped a few brave voices. Former aides, insiders, and anonymous contacts began speaking. Carefully, cautiously, they dropped hints. Not full stories, not explicit details, just enough to suggest that something more had occurred. Something the public wasn't meant to know immediately. And that suggestion, combined with the swirling car crash rumors, ignited an emotional reaction that no press release could contain. People were no longer questioning if something happened. They were questioning how serious it was. Was Meghan in danger? Was Harry involved in managing an immediate threat? Was there more at stake than a near-miss vehicle incident? The answers weren't coming. Not from the palace, not from Meghan's representatives, not even from eyewitness accounts. And this prolonged uncertainty fed the story's momentum, escalating tension in real time. Let's consider the psychological dimension for a moment. Continuous media speculation combined with silence can create a feedback loop. Fear prompts sharing. Sharing amplifies fear. Amplified fear increases demand for answers. The absence of reassurance only fuels further speculation. In this context, Meghan's silence was a double-edged sword. It protected her privacy, but it also amplified the drama. And the palace's terse statement, released without follow-up guidance, compounded the issue. Interestingly, the silence also revealed something about public trust. There was a subtle, almost involuntary shift in perception. For some, skepticism about Meghan softened. Concern replaced doubt. The narrative was no longer about scandal or critique. It became about vulnerability, humanity, and fragility. And just when this quiet tension was reaching its peak, a small, almost overlooked detail emerged. It wasn't an official confirmation. It wasn't a press release. It wasn't a viral post. It was a subtle change in behavior, a minor but telling action that hinted at urgency. Security protocols reportedly increased around her residence. Observers noticed unusual comings and goings at Montecito. And while no one could confirm specifics, these movements suggested that the palace and Meghan's team were actively managing a situation behind the scenes, something they were unwilling or unable to make public. That small, indirect clue created a new narrative. Now people weren't just imagining a car crash. They were imagining a coordinated response to an unfolding crisis. And when the imagination of millions begins to fill in gaps, reality becomes almost secondary. The contrast between silence and action created tension. Public observers were left questioning every detail. Every absence became significant. Every minor movement amplified. And here's the kicker. This is exactly the kind of environment insiders dread. It's unpredictable. It's uncontrollable. And it's emotionally exhausting, not only for Meghan, but for the people around her. In a strange way, the silence amplified the story more effectively than any statement could. Without providing answers, it forced the world to focus entirely on speculation, concern, and projection. It turned an ambiguous situation into an emotional event. And when the narrative grows beyond control, new voices inevitably enter. Social media analysts, celebrities, commentators, each with their own interpretation. Some sympathetic, some critical, each opinion layering onto the last. And now, the story isn't just about an incident. It's about trust, transparency, vulnerability, and the public's hunger for certainty in uncertainty. By the end of the day, the silence had transformed from protective to performative, whether intentionally or not. Every unanswered question, every unshared update, every absence of reassurance created tension that was impossible to ignore. And here's the moment that makes this chapter critical. While the world focused on the car incident, the quiet, almost imperceptible signals coming from Montecito were doing something even more powerful. They were preparing the stage for the next revelation, the one that would shock even those who had been following every detail closely. They weren't supposed to speak. Not publicly, not on the record, not in a way that would give anyone insight into the swirling chaos behind the palace walls. And yet, one aide did. It was quiet at first. A subtle comment to a trusted journalist, phrased casually, almost as if it were unimportant. But in the world of royal reporting, casual comments are rarely casual. Every word is scrutinized, every pause dissected, every implication considered. The aide's first words carried weight because they broke the silence. For months, insiders had been carefully maintaining discretion, respecting privacy, and controlling what was shared. Now a voice had slipped. Cautiously, cryptically, yet undeniably. "She's shaken," the aide said. Simple words. And yet, when paired with the timing of the palace announcement, the implication was explosive. What does shaken mean in this context? Physically? Emotionally? Socially? The ambiguity immediately fueled speculation. And once speculation starts, it rarely stops. Within hours, other insiders began dropping hints, all pointing in the same general direction. Something significant had occurred. But details were sparse, too sparse, which made every hint seem more urgent. For the public, every subtle leak became a puzzle piece. People connected dots that weren't always meant to connect. Observers analyzed travel schedules, social media posts, even patterns of security vehicle movement around Meghan's Montecito home. Every small anomaly became proof of a narrative that was still forming. And that's when contradictions emerged. Some insiders claimed the situation was under control. Others hinted at a more serious emotional or psychological impact. Some suggested a near accident. Others referenced a security protocol activation with almost the same urgency as a life-threatening event. Which was it? No one outside the palace really knew. But here's the pattern you need to understand. In moments like these, contradictions are not errors. They are signals. They indicate tension, disagreement, and pressure behind the scenes. They suggest that the situation is more complex than any single narrative can capture. Consider the emotional weight this placed on Meghan herself. Known for being resilient under public scrutiny, she was now facing multiple layers of exposure. The palace's announcement, the media frenzy, social media speculation, and, most importantly, the creeping fear that the story had begun to spiral beyond control. Ask yourself, how would you feel if everyone around you was talking, but no one was allowed to tell the truth? This is the environment the aide revealed, almost reluctantly, in their comments. Their words were measured, but the emotional resonance was palpable. Readers and viewers could sense the strain behind the careful phrasing. They could feel the stress, the vigilance, the exhaustion. And this revelation sparked something new. It shifted the story from a theoretical incident to a human narrative. Suddenly, people weren't debating facts as much as they were empathizing with someone at the center of intense scrutiny. Concern replaced speculation. Emotion replaced analysis. And in the world of public perception, that is a seismic change. But the aide's disclosures also hinted at something else. Not everything was being shared. Far from it. There were layers behind layers, conversations, decisions, and actions that were deliberately kept hidden. Each hint dropped by the aide suggested a broader context, one that involved both protection and management, one that balanced privacy with public interest, one that calculated the exact point at which information could be released without causing further panic. And yet, even with these hints, uncertainty remained. The public, naturally, wanted more. They wanted confirmation, clarification, and reassurance. They wanted to know the precise nature of the incident, whether anyone was hurt, and how Meghan was coping. But those questions went unanswered. And here's the critical point. The aide's disclosures, as controlled as they were, unintentionally amplified the tension. Because while the public now knew something was happening, they still didn't know what. Which is exactly the kind of situation that drives fear. people began connecting the dots themselves. They revisited past events in Meghan's life, moments of high stress, moments when she had spoken publicly about feeling overwhelmed, moments when her privacy had been breached. Each memory colored their interpretation of the current situation. And in that interpretive space, the narrative became almost unstoppable. It wasn't just about a car incident anymore. It was about vulnerability, pressure, and the human cost of constant scrutiny. The aide, in trying to provide clarity, had inadvertently deepened the emotional resonance of the story. Even more revealing were the subtle contradictions in the aide's statements. Some phrases suggested immediacy, others implied caution. Some hinted at control, others at chaos. Each contradiction was examined, amplified, and debated. This is the paradox of insider commentary. It can illuminate, but it can also complicate. It offers fragments of truth, but those fragments are powerful because they leave so much unsaid. And that unsaid space is where the story thrives. Because what the public doesn't know, they will imagine. What they imagine, they will share. And once shared, it becomes part of the narrative, inseparable from confirmed facts. By the end of the day, the aide's comments had transformed the story. No longer was it about speculation or rumor. It was about a living, breathing scenario involving real people, emotions, and stakes. And yet, even with this illumination, one question lingered, unanswered and unavoidable. If the aide knew enough to speak, then what else did they know that they weren't saying? The implications were chilling. The controlled disclosure suggested layers of events that were invisible to the public. It hinted at interventions, decisions, and actions that had been executed quietly, yet were powerful enough to affect perception and emotion worldwide. And the most unsettling part? These quiet interventions, these hidden measures, were happening precisely because the story had already begun to spiral. They were damage control, not just reactive, but preemptive. And when preemptive measures are in place, it often means the situation was serious enough to require them, even if the public never sees the full picture. That's the critical tension the aide revealed. Something had occurred, something serious enough to warrant action, something delicate enough to require discretion. And yet, the public could only see the ripples, not the source. Which brings us to the final point of this chapter. The aide's revelations, limited as they were, set the stage for the next level of the story. Because behind every hint, every carefully chosen word, every contradiction, lay the reality of someone navigating pressure, danger, and intense public scrutiny simultaneously. What does it do to a person to never be believed? That's the question you have to ask when looking at Meghan Markle's story up to this point. Because for years, she has existed in a unique and often contradictory space. Loved by some, criticized by others, constantly under the microscope. Always being judged, not just for her actions, but for her intentions, her choices, her very existence within the royal family. Now, imagine the pressure of all of that converging at a single moment. A moment punctuated by a sudden, alarming announcement from Kensington Palace. A moment when whispers of a car crash circulate online, unverified yet emotionally potent. And a moment when your own team, your own family, and the institution that surrounds you all seem to speak in riddles or not at all. This is where Meghan's experience becomes a case study in resilience and vulnerability. Let's start with what the public sees. Meghan appears composed in photos. She maintains a carefully curated social media presence. She continues public appearances when necessary. She speaks on causes she cares about. From a distance, it might appear that she is unshakable, but perception is not reality. For someone constantly scrutinized, even minor events can feel magnified. Every movement observed, every word analyzed, every gesture dissected for intent. And when an incident occurs, or even when rumors of an incident circulate, the emotional toll is multiplied. What does it mean to live under that kind of pressure? To have every action amplified, every misstep assumed, every emotion politicized? The stakes aren't just personal. They're professional, familial, and public. The consequences of misjudgment or misinterpretation are immediate and far-reaching. Consider this. When rumors of the car incident emerged, Meghan had to process multiple layers of reality simultaneously. First, there was the factual side. Whatever actually happened during the alleged incident? Then there was the media narrative, partially accurate, partially speculative, overwhelmingly amplified. Then there was the palace's statement, brief, formal, and lacking detail. Finally, there was the public's emotional reaction, a blend of empathy, criticism, and curiosity. It's a lot to manage for anyone. And yet, Meghan has navigated this terrain for years. She has had to develop emotional armor strong enough to withstand scrutiny, yet flexible enough to adapt to sudden crises. But armor has its limits. Even the strongest individuals have breaking points. Emotional fatigue builds quietly. Pressure accumulates invisibly. And when events converge, as they did with the palace announcement and the alleged car crash, the burden can become almost unbearable. This is why understanding Meghan's long-term experience is critical. It contextualizes the current crisis. It explains why silence, from the palace, from Harry, even from Meghan herself, carries such weight. It reveals why small details, leaked hints, and subtle signals are interpreted as profoundly significant. Now let's address the irony embedded in this situation. For years, Meghan has been criticized for speaking out, for asserting her perspective, for sharing her experiences, for claiming her voice. Yet in moments like this, the absence of her voice becomes a central narrative. The very institution that may have once pushed for her silence now speaks on her behalf, yet still does not offer reassurance or clarity. And the public, conditioned by years of seeing her both scrutinized and silenced, reacts accordingly. Concern replaces judgment. Anxiety replaces critique. Empathy replaces skepticism. It's a dramatic reversal, highlighting the emotional paradox that defines Meghan's public life. Being simultaneously empowered and vulnerable, visible yet unheard, scrutinized yet ignored. This paradox intensifies when we consider the broader context of public scrutiny in modern celebrity and royalty. Meghan's experience is not unique in the sense that public figures are often under pressure, but it is unique in how personal stakes intersect with institutional expectations. She is not merely a celebrity or a royal. She is a symbol, a lightning rod, and a participant in a centuries-old institution that operates on tradition, hierarchy, and control. And that combination amplifies everything. Every rumor, every statement, every omission, every small gesture, even a minor car incident, real or imagined, becomes a high-stakes emotional event. That's why the aide's revelations, the palace's announcement, and the public's reaction all converge in a perfect storm of pressure. Each element feeds into the next, creating layers of emotional complexity that are impossible to untangle from the outside. But let's dig deeper into the psychological implications. When someone is never believed, when their experiences are constantly questioned or reframed, the impact is cumulative. It fosters hypervigilance, self-doubt, and heightened sensitivity to external signals. Every social media post, every news article, every subtle shift in public opinion is internalized. And when a crisis emerges, even a minor one, it interacts with this history, intensifying stress and emotional strain. For Meghan, the palace announcement acted as both validation and threat. Validation, because it acknowledged that concern was warranted. Threat, because it implied that the story had reached a level requiring institutional attention. And the alleged car crash, even unconfirmed, reinforced the perception of risk. The emotional tension is compounded by isolation. Physical distance from trusted allies, combined with the absence of clear communication, creates a sense of vulnerability. When people around you are silent or withholding information, uncertainty becomes a constant companion. And that's precisely what happened. Observers outside the inner circle may have thought silence was strategic, but from the inside, silence can feel like exposure. It heightens anxiety, magnifies stakes, and amplifies every uncertainty. Which is why even minor leaks or hints, like the aide statements, carry disproportionate weight. They act as fragments of truth in a sea of ambiguity. And the public, starved for context, interprets these fragments through an emotional lens. Suddenly, what might have been a minor incident takes on monumental significance, not because of the event itself, but because of the emotional ecosystem surrounding it. This interplay of perception, vulnerability, and public scrutiny is central to understanding the current moment. It explains why a single announcement from Kensington Palace can provoke global concern. It explains why whispers from an aide can dominate headlines. It explains why the absence of Meghan's voice resonates more loudly than words ever could. Now consider the broader irony. For years, Meghan's critics framed her as combative, self-interested, or manipulative. Yet in moments of real human vulnerability, the narrative flips. The public sympathizes. The media reinterprets. The story becomes about endurance, resilience, and the weight of constant observation. And that shift is not trivial. It influences the trajectory of the story, the framing of subsequent announcements, and even the strategies employed by the palace and Meghan's team. Because in a high-pressure, emotionally charged environment, perception often becomes more important than reality. By the end of this chapter, one conclusion is unavoidable. The intersection of public scrutiny, institutional control, and individual vulnerability creates a perfect storm for emotional tension. And in Meghan Markle's case, that storm is intensified by years of prior experiences, accumulated pressure, and the persistent question of credibility. Which brings us to a critical point. Even as the palace and Meghan's team navigate these dynamics, one unresolved question hangs in the air. How much of the current situation is the result of past pressures converging, and how much is new, immediate risk? The moments after a crisis are often the most revealing, not because of what is said, but because of what is done. In the case of Meghan Markle and the swirling rumors of a car incident, action unfolded quietly behind the scenes, and it was deliberate, calculated, and instructive. While the world speculated about severity and consequence, security teams, aides, and the palace were already in motion, each step designed to manage risk, control perception, and protect those involved. Let's break this down. First, consider the logistics of protection in high-profile situations. A royal, or someone of Meghan's status, is never truly alone. Security teams operate continuously, monitoring travel, surroundings, and potential threats. When an incident, real or potential, is detected, protocols are triggered immediately. Routes are adjusted. Vehicles are repositioned. Personnel is reassigned. And all of this happens in a way meant to be invisible to the public eye. In this case, reports later suggested that such protocols were indeed activated. Cars were rerouted. Drivers received last-minute instructions. Security personnel were on heightened alert. And yet, none of this was publicly confirmed at the time. That invisibility is intentional. It keeps the incident from becoming a spectacle while maintaining safety. Now, here's the critical part. The presence of these measures doesn't necessarily confirm a physical crash. It confirms the potential for risk, which is enough to create tension and justify concern. And in situations like this, perception of risk can sometimes be as powerful as the event itself. While the palace statement focused on acknowledgement without detail, the behind-the-scenes actions suggested urgency. That dissonance between words and action fueled speculation. Observers noticed patterns. A sudden absence from public life. Reports of unusual security activity. Social media chatter about unseen movements. All these factors combined to create an impression of crisis, whether or not the physical event had occurred exactly as reported. Next, consider communication strategy. High-profile teams must carefully calibrate messaging during sensitive situations. Too much disclosure can endanger privacy. Too little disclosure can amplify panic. In Meghan's case, the choice to release a brief palace statement served as a balancing act. It signaled concern and legitimacy without revealing specifics that could compromise safety or personal privacy. But strategic restraint has consequences. In an era of instant social media, even a minimal statement becomes fodder for debate, speculation, and rumor. And in Meghan's case, the context of prior scrutiny amplified every word and every omission. Here's where the psychology of perception becomes relevant. When the public interprets silence or vague statements, the mind fills gaps with narratives that often exaggerate the stakes. Emotional investment, combined with incomplete information, produces a heightened sense of urgency. Fear amplifies fear. Concern amplifies concern. Every minor rumor gains momentum. Even insiders acknowledged this. Later reporting indicated that the palace and Meghan's team were monitoring both mainstream media and social media closely, not just for factual accuracy, but for the emotional temperature of public reaction. Every trending topic, every viral post, every amplified speculation was analyzed for impact. This leads to an essential insight. The story wasn't just about a possible car incident. It was about perception management, emotional resonance, and narrative control, all operating simultaneously behind the scenes. Now consider the personal impact. For Meghan, navigating this storm requires emotional agility. She must process potential threats, manage stress, maintain composure, and consider public perception, all under intense scrutiny. And remember, this is compounded by historical pressure. Prior media attacks, public critique, and institutional tension all feed into the psychological load. Even small details, such as a delayed social media post or an adjusted public schedule, take on symbolic meaning. They are interpreted as signals, proof of involvement, or evidence of concern, whether accurate or not. The amplification effect is enormous. Let's examine one more critical dimension: timing. The Palace statement came at a moment carefully chosen to intervene without controlling fully. It was reactive, but intentional. The timing ensured that the acknowledgement preceded speculative peaks on social media, attempting to frame the narrative subtly while avoiding unnecessary disclosure. And yet, timing is a double-edged sword. Because while it may reduce risk of misinterpretation initially, it also creates a window in which speculation grows unchecked. Once that window opens, the narrative can take on a life of its own. Exactly what happened here. Security, strategy, communication, timing. All of these elements coalesced into a carefully orchestrated response that the public could only interpret partially. The result? Heightened emotional stakes and a perception of urgency that may or may not have reflected the actual severity of the incident. But here's the most important point. Action speaks louder than words. Even with minimal statements, the measured, behind-the-scenes actions revealed that something had occurred that warranted immediate attention. Whether it was a minor scare, a procedural event, or a near accident, the response itself indicated seriousness. And the public instinctively sensed that. They noticed patterns. They connected historical context. They interpreted movement and absence as part of a larger, unfolding story. This is where the next layer of drama emerges: the interplay between control and unpredictability. Even the most carefully orchestrated response cannot fully contain perception. Information spreads unevenly. Rumors circulate faster than clarifications. Emotions escalate while facts lag behind. In Meghan's case, the orchestrated actions of palace staff and security teams created a paradox, effective in practice, but unpredictable in perception. And that unpredictability is where the story truly intensifies. Because in moments like this, the stakes are not just about physical safety. They are about trust, narrative authority, emotional resilience, and the fragile balance between privacy and public scrutiny. By the end of this chapter, one reality is unavoidable. What happened, and how it was handled, has consequences far beyond the immediate incident. It has ripple effects on public perception, institutional credibility, and personal well-being. The ripple effects of crisis management are rarely linear. They spread like concentric waves, touching every corner of perception, emotion, and influence. In Meghan Markle's case, the incident, whether real, perceived, or partially both, triggered waves that extended far beyond the immediate moment. First, consider the role of narrative control. Kensington Palace's statement was brief, measured, and formal. Its purpose was not to reassure the public fully, but to assert authority. We acknowledge this situation, and it is being managed. That message is subtle, but it carries weight. It signals that the institution is aware, involved, and controlling the flow of information. Yet, the brevity also invited speculation. In the absence of detail, humans instinctively fill the gaps. The public, conditioned by previous royal controversies and media scrutiny of Meghan, naturally imagined scenarios far more dramatic than likely occurred. And in the age of social media, imagined scenarios spread faster than facts, amplifying concern and emotional investment. This interplay between official messaging and public perception is critical. It demonstrates a fundamental truth. Information is not just about accuracy. It is about timing, framing, and emotional resonance. And in this case, Each element worked in tandem to heighten both curiosity and anxiety. Next, consider the psychological impact on Meghan herself. As someone who has spent years navigating intense media scrutiny, she is no stranger to public speculation. Yet, the current situation presented a unique challenge, combining real-world risk with amplified perception. Every movement, every social media update, every absence became a signal that could be interpreted in multiple, often contradictory ways. Add to that the dimension of relational dynamics. Harry and Meghan's distance from the palace, both physically and symbolically, creates complexity. They operate outside traditional royal structures, yet remain inexorably tied to them. This duality means that palace statements, aid leaks, and media coverage carry different implications than they would for other members of the family. Each act, each omission, each hint of information is loaded with significance. Now let's address the public's role in this unfolding story. Audiences are not passive observers. They are active participants. Social media platforms, comment sections, and forums allow instantaneous reactions, interpretations, and judgments. In Meghan's case, the emotional stakes are high. Supporters interpret ambiguity as a call to defend. Critics interpret the same ambiguity as confirmation of suspicion. Neutral observers oscillate between concern and curiosity. The result is a fractal amplification of every signal, intentional or not. This amplification is compounded by the ambiguity of the term incident. Unlike a clear statement such as minor fender bender or security precaution, the word incident invites interpretation. Is it emotional, physical, accidental, deliberate? The lack of specificity allows the mind to construct worst-case scenarios, often far more dramatic than reality. And then there's the irony. For years, Meghan has been critiqued for the perceived way she navigates media narratives.